Christmas Eve wrapped the corporate tower in glassy light and artificial snow. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above marble floors, and the scent of pine, cinnamon, and expensive perfume floated through the air. Suits laughed too loudly. Champagne clinked like distant bells. It was the kind of night built for power and appearances. Caleb Johnson slipped inside quietly through the side entrance, holding his daughter's small hand. His dark work uniform was neatly pressed but faded from too many washes. At 36, he carried himself with a calm, wary dignity, the kind that came from years of surviving without complaint. To the guests, he was invisible, just another maintenance worker passing through the shadows. Lily Johnson, 7 years old, all bright eyes and bouncing curls, tugged on his hand with restless excitement. The towering Christmas tree near the lobby sparkled like something out of a fairy tale. She stared at the lights as if they belonged to another world. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft and hopeful, "can you play the piano before we go? Just a little song so I can sleep?" Caleb hesitated. The piano sat in the corner of the grand hall, elegant and untouched, more decorative than used. He hadn't played in public for years, not since the accident, not since his right hand learned what pain truly meant. Still, Lily's trusting eyes left him defenseless. "Just one," he said gently. He sat at the bench. The room barely noticed at first. Then his fingers touched the keys. The melody arrived like a quiet breath, tender, aching, intimate. Each note unfolded with fragile precision, like memories tiptoeing back into the light. Conversations faded, laughter softened. The air itself seemed to pause. High above on the mezzanine, Victoria Wright stood frozen. Her perfectly poised smile collapsed as the music reached her ears. Cold recognition gripped her chest. Her hand found the brass railing as her breath turned shallow. That melody, no, that song, had not been heard in 16 years. It was the last gift from the boy she once loved, the one who died too young on a rain-slicked highway. Her heart pounded violently. Down below, Caleb played with closed eyes, unaware that every note was reopening a wound long buried in gold and silence. And somewhere between the sound of the piano and the fall of artificial snow, a past that refused to stay buried was quietly rising. The last note of the song faded into a fragile hush. For a heartbeat, the room seemed unsure how to breathe again. Then the murmur of voices slowly returned, cautious, unsettled. Lily slipped from Caleb's side, drawn by the glowing dessert table like a magnet. Chocolate fountains shimmered under warm lights. Strawberries dipped in dark syrup looked like tiny treasures. She stretched on her tiptoes, fingers trembling, just short of reaching one. Her foot slid. The fall was sudden and sharp. Her knee struck the marble with a hollow crack that cut through the music still hanging in the air. Lily's face twisted in shock before her cry broke loose, thin, startled, aching. Blood blossomed through her white tights. Caleb was on the floor in seconds. He dropped beside her, arms wrapping around her small trembling body, his voice low and steady as his hands moved with instinctive care. He pressed his handkerchief gently against her knee, blinking back the terror rising in his chest. Hey, it's okay, baby. Daddy's here." Nearby guests stared, the quiet kind of staring that held curiosity but not compassion. Then a voice, sharp and irritated, sliced through the moment. "For God's sake, control your child." Evan Brooks stepped forward, his tailored suit immaculate, his eyes hard with open disdain. He glanced at the small smear of blood on the marble as if it were a personal offense. "This is a corporate function," he snapped, "not a daycare. There are entrances for staff for a reason." The word staff landed like a strike. Lily shrank closer to her father, her small hands clutching his shirt. Caleb lifted his gaze slowly. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained measured. "She slipped. She's 7. Evans scoffed. "Then maybe you shouldn't have brought her where she doesn't belong." A hush fell again, thicker, heavier than before. From the upper level, heels echoed deliberately against the steps. Victoria Wright was coming down, and the temperature in the room shifted. The echo of Evan's words still hung in the air when the sound of heels cut through the silence. Slow, deliberate, unignorable. Victoria Wright descended the stairs with the calm authority of someone who was used to rooms bending around her. Every step was composed, every breath controlled. The crowd parted without being asked. She stopped directly in front of Evan. "You don't speak to people in my building like that," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. the kind of tone that didn't need force to command. Evan stiffened. Victoria, I was just... You were humiliating a father holding his injured child, she cut in front of my guests. The room felt smaller, tighter. Lily whimpered softly, pressing her face into Caleb's chest. Caleb stood slowly, still shielding her body with his own. He said nothing. His silence was heavier than any argument. Victoria turned her gaze to them. For the first time, her eyes softened. Not with restraint, but with something almost human. There's a first aid kit in the executive lounge, she said gently. 5th floor. Private elevator. I'll have someone assist you. Caleb hesitated, then nodded once. Thank you. As he carried Lily away, whispers followed in their wake. Not cruel this time, just uncertain. Victoria remained where she was, her back straight, her jaw tight. Behind her, Evan exhaled sharply. You embarrassed me. Victoria didn't turn around. No, she said evenly. You embarrassed yourself. Minutes later, the tension faded into uneasy chatter. Someone uncovered the piano again. A few guests drifted closer, curiosity returning like a hesitant tide. From the hallway, Lily's small voice floated back into the room, soft, sleepy, hopeful. Daddy, can you play one more time before we go? Caleb's steps slowed. He looked down at her bandaged knee, at her tired but trusting eyes. And once again, against his better judgment, he turned back toward the piano. From the mezzanine, Victoria lifted her head. The song was about to return. The piano answered Lily's request with a trembling first note. Caleb sat once more on the bench, his shoulders tight, his breath shallow. The room quieted again, not with curiosity this time, but with expectation. He closed his eyes, and then the melody returned. But this time it went deeper. The notes unfurled slowly, like a confession whispered into the dark. The music carried longing, regret, devotion, the kind of emotions that didn't belong to a background tune at a corporate party. It felt personal, too personal. On the mezzanine, Victoria froze. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was impossible. This version of the song wasn't just familiar, it was complete. It was the version she remembered hearing only once in her entire life, beneath a blanket of summer stars, from the boy who never had the chance to grow old. Her knees weakened. When the final note faded, silence crashed over the room like a wave. A few guests clapped uncertainly. Others didn't move at all. Victoria was already descending the stairs. She stopped just a few feet from Caleb as he stood. Lily nestled sleepily against his chest. Where did you learn that song? She asked. Her voice was quiet but raw around the edges. Caleb hesitated. His eyes flicked instinctively to Lily. It's just an old melody, he said carefully. Something I heard a long time ago. Victoria's breath caught. That song had only one composer. She stepped closer, close enough now to see the faint scars along his fingers, the stiffness in the way his right hand rested. No one else in the world should know how it ends. Caleb's jaw tightened. Lily shifted in his arms. It's okay, Daddy, I'm sleepy. That broke the moment. Caleb lowered his gaze. I need to take her home. Victoria stepped back slowly, as if giving space to something fragile and dangerous. Of course. As he turned to leave, Victoria remained frozen at the edge of the piano, her heart racing, her past shaking violently inside her chest. The song that should have died 16 years ago had just walked back into her life. Victoria didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the melody returned. Soft, aching, impossibly precise. The way Caleb's fingers had moved across the keys replayed in her mind with unsettling clarity. The scars on his hand, the hesitation in his voice, the fear in his eyes. By dawn, she was already in her office. Pull the maintenance employee file for Caleb Johnson, she told her assistant without looking up. Immediately. Minutes later, the folder lay open on her desk. And it made no sense. Age 36, maintenance staff, night shift. No higher education listed. Prior work, warehouse, grocery store, temp labor. No awards, no music training, no history, no wife. Only one emergency contact, his daughter Lily Johnson, age 7. Victoria flipped through the pages faster. Nothing about talent, nothing about performance, nothing about piano. It was as if his life had been erased on paper. Her fingers tightened against the edge of the desk. This man played like someone who once had a future, she murmured to herself. You don't learn that between fixing air vents and mopping floors. A shadow crossed her desk. Her assistant hesitated. There is one thing, Ms. Wright. The background check flagged an old settlement under your father's former production company. 12 years ago. Workplace injury, equipment failure. Victoria's stomach dropped. Details? He was injured during a stage setup. Severe hand trauma. Career ending. The company paid medical expenses. Contract was terminated afterward. Victoria leaned back slowly, the air leaving her lungs. A pianist, crushed by a stage, silenced by money. The pieces clicked together like glass. She looked out at the city waking beneath her windows, feeling something shift inside her chest. Something unsteady and irreversible. Find his current address, she said quietly, and cancel my afternoon meetings. Her assistant blinked. All of them? Yes, because somewhere in the shadows of this city, a man who should never have known that song was carrying answers she could no longer ignore. And she was done pretending it was coincidence. The address led Victoria to the east side of the city, where streetlights flickered and brick buildings leaned into one another like tired old men. It wasn't the kind of place she usually visited, but tonight she didn't bring a driver. She needed to do this alone. She climbed the narrow stairs to the third floor. A single bulb buzzed above the hallway. Apartment 3C. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder. Still nothing. After a long moment, the door across the hall creaked open. An elderly woman peered out, wrapped in a worn cardigan. "You looking for the man with the little girl?" the woman asked. Victoria's throat tightened. "Yes, are they home?" The woman shook her head slowly. "They left 3 days ago, packed up quick, paid the rest of the month's rent in cash." "Did they say where they were going?" "No, ma'am, just said it was time to move on." The door closed. Victoria stood frozen in the dim hallway, the silence pressing against her chest. 3 days. He had vanished the moment she started asking questions, as if the truth itself had chased him away. Her phone buzzed. Her assistant. "Ms. Wright, we just received word. Mr. Johnson requested a full termination from his position, effective immediately." Victoria pressed her free hand to the wall to steady herself. He ran, not for money, not for attention, but for protection. She imagined Lily's small hands gripping a suitcase too big for her, the way she had leaned into her father's chest at the party, the instinctive fear in his eyes when Victoria asked about the song. Guilt cut through her like ice. "I pushed too hard," she whispered. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, thick, and silent. And somewhere beneath that falling white, a man with a scarred hand and a hidden past was disappearing into the city with the only person he trusted, his daughter. That night, the snow came down thick and soundless. Victoria left the office long after midnight. The city outside her windows had softened. Sirens muted, traffic slowed, every rooftop dressed in white. She wrapped her coat tighter as she stepped into the cold, the silence pressing in around her thoughts. Then she heard it. Piano. Faint at first, fragile, drifting upward through the vast lobby like a forgotten breath. Her heart stuttered. She moved without thinking, heels tapping fast against marble as she descended the stairs. Each note pulled her forward, undeniable, impossible. The melody unfolded slow and sorrowful. Starry promise, but changed. Older, wounded, like it had learned how to grieve. At the piano, a single figure sat in the dim light. Caleb. His back was rigid, shoulders bowed under invisible weight. His scarred hand trembled as it moved across the keys. He played not for a room this time, but for memory, for regret, for the life he had buried. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly without turning. Victoria stopped several feet behind him. "Neither should this song," she replied. The final note faded into the air. Caleb rose slowly. When he faced her, his eyes were tired. No longer guarded, just worn thin by too many truths left unspoken. "I ran," he said, "because Lily asked why people kept staring at us. And I didn't know how to explain your world to her." Victoria swallowed hard. "And the song?" His jaw tightened. "Because you deserve to know why it was never really gone." She stepped closer, snowmelt dripping from her coat onto the marble floor. "Did you write it, Caleb?" she asked gently. "The ending that shouldn't exist?" For a long moment, the only sound was the hush of falling snow against glass. Then he nodded. "Yes." The truth settled between them, heavy, irreversible. And for the first time since the piano began that night, neither of them looked away. The silence between them felt heavier than the snow outside. Victoria spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell me everything." Caleb lowered his gaze to his right hand. The scars caught the pale lobby light, twisted, uneven, like the remains of something once whole. I was 16 when I finished that song, he said slowly. Your Noah had the beginning, 8 bars, beautiful but incomplete. He was stuck, angry at himself, so he asked for help. Victoria's breath hitched. He knew how I felt about you, Caleb continued. He wasn't cruel about it. He said music didn't belong to one heart. It belonged to whoever needed it. I finished the song in one night. Every note was for you. Tears gathered in Victoria's eyes. Why didn't you ever tell me? Caleb gave a soft, broken smile. Because he was brave. I wasn't. And because love sometimes looks like stepping aside. His voice darkened. 3 years later, I signed a performance contract. First real chance of my life. The stage rig collapsed during setup. Cheap equipment, rushed inspection. My hand was crushed under steel and bone. Victoria felt sick. 3 surgeries, months of pain. Doctors said I'd never play professionally again. The company paid my hospital bills, then voided my contract. He looked up at her then, eyes steady. That company was owned by your father. The words hung like a verdict. I took the settlement because I had no fight left. I washed dishes, stocked shelves, fixed broken wires. And then Lily was born, and the music just became something I played when the world wasn't looking. Victoria wiped at the tears she could no longer hide. You lost everything. Caleb shook his head gently. No, I lost the stage, but not the song. Outside, snow continued to fall, and between them stood 16 years of silence, finally undone. The quiet after Caleb's confession barely had time to breathe. The glass doors of the lobby slid open with a sharp, mechanical hiss. Evan Brooks walked in first, his coat dusted with snow, his expression tight with restrained fury. 2 steps behind him came Richard Wright, tall, silver-haired, wrapped in the cold authority of a man who had never been told no in his life. Victoria stiffened. I wondered how long it would take, Richard said dryly, his gaze sliding to Caleb with open contempt. My daughter hiding in the dark with maintenance. Caleb's shoulders squared, instinctively placing himself closer to Victoria without touching her. You don't get to speak about him that way, Victoria said, her voice low but dangerous. Evan laughed without humor. This is exactly my concern, Victoria. You're letting a janitor drag you into a scandal. Investors are already whispering, and now I find you here, alone with him. Caleb spoke calmly. I'm not here to take anything from her. Richard scoffed. That's what all desperate men say. You already took enough from my company. Victoria turned sharply toward her father. Your company destroyed his career. Richard's eyes hardened. It was business, faulty equipment, unfortunate, settled legally. You crushed his hand, she snapped. You crushed his future. Evan stepped forward, voice cold. And now you're about to crush your own. Our engagement announcement goes public in 6 weeks. If they find out about this, about him, you'll lose the board. You'll lose everything. Victoria looked at them both. At the man who had sold safety for profit. At the man who measured love by stock value. Then she looked at Caleb. And she finally understood what everything was worth. I won't lose everything, she said quietly. I'll only lose you. The words landed like a strike. Evan stared at her in shock. Richard's jaw tightened with rage. And in that frozen instant, the lines were drawn. Not between the powerful and the weak, but between who she had been trained to be and who she had finally chosen to become. The silence after Victoria's words felt electric, tight, dangerous. Evan was the first to recover. His laugh was sharp, disbelief edged with anger. You're throwing away your future for him? He nodded toward Caleb like he was pointing at a stain. You'll regret this, I promise you that. Richard stepped forward slowly, his voice low and cutting. I raised you to be stronger than sentiment. You don't sacrifice power for feelings. Victoria met her father's gaze without blinking. You taught me how to win. You never taught me how to be human. His face darkened. This man is nothing but guilt and trouble. Caleb finally spoke. I don't want her to lose anything because of me. Victoria turned to him, her voice soft but unshakable. This isn't about you being a loss. It's about me finally choosing what matters. She reached up and unfastened the diamond ring from her finger. The stone caught the lobby light one last time before she placed it in Evan's open palm. Our engagement is over. Evan stared at the ring as if it had burned him. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious in my life. Richard's control cracked. If you walk away from this, you walk away from the board, the investors, the protection this family gives you. Victoria exhaled slowly. Then I'll stand without it. Evan's voice dropped into a threat. I have documents. Acquisitions that won't survive the press. Then release them, she said. If I've done wrong, I'll answer for it. But I won't hide behind lies anymore. Security was already moving in. Quiet, firm. As Evan was escorted out, his eyes never left Victoria. You just made an enemy, he warned. Richard lingered only a moment, his gaze cold. You chose a janitor over your blood. Victoria's reply was steady. No, I chose truth over fear. When the doors finally closed behind them, the lobby felt vast and fragile. Victoria turned to Caleb. For the first time since the music began that night, the world was silent, and everything had changed. 1 year passed like a slow exhale after a long-held breath. The scandal Evan had promised did come, but it didn't bury Victoria the way he expected. Truth moved faster than threats. Investors hesitated, then returned. The board fractured, then reformed. And for the first time in her life, Victoria learned how to stand without a shield. Caleb rebuilt his world quietly. He didn't return to the stage right away. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the wound that had shaped him. Instead, he began teaching piano at a small community center across town. The room was old, the keys imperfect, the heaters unreliable. But the children were bright, hungry, alive with sound. Lily sat in the front row every afternoon, swinging her legs, watching her father with proud, unblinking eyes as he guided small, uncertain hands across the keys. Music returned to him, not as applause, but as laughter. Victoria often stood in the doorway, unnoticed, listening. She funded the center without attaching her name to it. She created a scholarship in Noah's memory. And every month, she came to sit among folding chairs and cracked floors, watching broken pianos create unbroken hope. Then came the charity concert. A full hall, warm lights, a packed audience waiting in breathless suspense. Caleb walked onto the stage in a simple black suit, his scarred hand steady at his side. Lily followed him, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his. The crowd rose without being told. At the piano, he began Story Promise again. But this time, the ending changed. The old sorrow softened into something gentler, braver, a final movement filled with rising hope, second chances, and unanswered tomorrows. Backstage, Victoria covered her mouth as tears slid freely down her face. For the first time in 16 years, the music did not whisper of loss. It spoke of life, and the world listened. The applause at the charity concert didn't fade quickly. It rolled through the hall like a living thing, warm, relentless, alive. When Caleb finally lifted his hands from the keys, the crowd was already on its feet. Lily looked up at her father in awe, as if only now realizing just how far his music could reach. Backstage, Victoria waited. Caleb found her standing beneath the soft glow of corridor lights, her eyes shining with quiet emotion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Some silences were not empty. They were full. You changed the ending, she said gently. He nodded. The old one belonged to loss. This one belongs to what comes after. She stepped closer. To us? Caleb smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, but real. To tomorrow. Outside, spring arrived without ceremony. Cherry blossoms dusted the sidewalks in pale pink. Lily ran through the park in a bright jacket, laughing as petals clung to her curls. Caleb and Victoria sat on a weathered bench nearby, shoulders brushing, watching her chase sunlight like it was something she could catch. For the first time in a long time, none of them were running from anything. Victoria turned toward him. I spent my life thinking strength meant control, power, distance. She paused, searching his face. You showed me strength can also mean patience, and staying, even when it's hard. Caleb looked at his scarred hand, then at hers when she reached for him. Music taught me that broken things can still make beautiful sound. People aren't so different. That night, after Lily was tucked into bed with her favorite stuffed bear and a sleepy smile, Caleb sat at the piano in Victoria's apartment. The room glowed with quiet lamplight. She leaned against the doorway, listening as a new melody began to take shape. Tentative, hopeful, unfinished in the best way. What is it called, No? She asked. Caleb thought for a moment. Second movement, she laughed softly. Because the story isn't over. Because it's just beginning. Later, as they stood together at the window watching the city breathe under the night sky, Victoria whispered, Do you think people really get more than one chance at a life? Caleb answered without hesitation. Only if they're brave enough to take it. And maybe that's the real question left behind by their story. If you were given a second chance at love, at truth, at becoming who you were always meant to be, would you take it, even if it meant losing everything you once had? Some promises are written in music, some are written in sacrifice, and some are written every day by simply choosing to stay. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional, life-changing stories about love, courage, and second chances. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Subscribe now and stay with us on this journey.